Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of, say, late 1700s, early 1800s slaves in, locally born, American-born slaves in North America. Here's some interesting things that I sort of really stumbled across, I guess. But now remember, slavery has been an institution that goes back as far as recorded history. So recorded history began about 6,000 years ago, give or take, stone tablets, that sort of stuff, etchings. And they were very clear at depicting slaves and I guess pretty much throughout history, and for the most part, not exclusively, in most instances, the slavery has been a labour exchange. This is when the population of the world was, much, much less than it is today. There weren't sort of surplus populations in the way we would see them today. So if you wanted to get work done, you really had to have, where do you find these workers from? Well, slaves. So that was pretty much a thing all around the world since the beginning of time. Now, the black, the sub-Saharan black type areas of Africa, slavery was very much part of their economy, the buying, selling, and trading of slaves. In the Islamic world, so after the 600s, then slaves became a much bigger part of what they were doing, and also there was an element of, if you're a non-Muslim, then you're a lesser creature, an attitude that you see today, for example. White people, Christians, are lesser creatures than the Islamic folks, and then so the Western Christian countries are importing millions of Islamic folks and wondering why it's not working out so well. Can't think why. But I just wanted to focus on I came across some slave auction documents that go back to the late 1700s and early 1800s. Again, this is locally born North American slaves. And now the slaves, as they perceived, the slavery as they perceived at the time, isn't the race grifting element that we see it, is used today. Back then, it was just a labour. It was just labour. That's what it was. It wasn't a subjugation matter. It was just labour. Now, in the same way that a white person could be indentured as an apprentice for 20 years before they'd get their freedom, if even then. So looking at the auctions, there'd be, say, 25 slaves for auction. And again, these are locally born US slaves. Now, the headlines of these auction listings were the most qualified slaves. And now remember, these are white people who are putting this together, but they would describe, Joseph or whatever. There was no Kunta Kinte stuff back then. They would describe Joseph and say Joseph is a master blacksmith and has superior technical skills. So-and-so is a master stonemason. He is superior at this job. Someone else was a carpenter, or someone else was an expert ship's chandler, like repairing and maintaining sailing ships. Someone else was an expert violinist, and someone else was, spoke 3 languages, like French, English, and Spanish. This is the slaves. Other ones were is a superior nurse, gifted at nursing, particularly children, and the list goes on. One was an expert cook. So bear in mind that they're probably trying to gin it up a little bit to get a better price, but the reality is that the white people are describing their supposed slaves as superior skilled craftsmen or cooks or whatever the case might be. Now, these people commanded the big prices. If you're a master blacksmith, then, technically superior at this trade, if you're a master blacksmith, then you must most likely or much more likely to get a higher price than if you're just, Now, for slaves that had no skills or were considered sort of lazy or slothful, that sort of stuff, sometimes the plantation owner had to pay someone to take the slave. So there was that. But there were, aside, certainly the ones for auction that I've seen, there were somewhere between 15 and 20% of the auction lists were highly skilled, or so the auction lists claim, highly skilled black people. You don't become a master craftsman in blacksmithing just because you can throw a hammer around or something. This takes a while to learn, and the blacksmiths were really the centre of the village. They were considered to be highly skilled tradespeople. They're going to shoe your horse and do all your metal work and iron work and and so on. So this is, they've got to operate bellows, and they've got to get the right combo of charcoal and all these sorts of things to get the metal so it's pliable enough to be hammered into shape. So this is a skill. Whoever's got it, white or black, it's a skill. So, and quite a long apprenticeship, by the way. It was not unusual for a blacksmith to take on an apprentice at, say, 12 years old, and the apprenticeship could last 8 or 9 years. Now, anyway, this is what then surprised me was that this was an era when a slave could buy their freedom. They could effectively pay out the cost of acquiring them and keeping them, a sum that was agreed, and they could say, okay, and then they could go off and set up their own blacksmithing business down the road, or go interstate, or go up the northeast where they were much better received, and that sort of thing. Now, why did so few, in fact a tiny proportion, less than 1% of the skilled people, why did they not take up that opportunity to buy their freedom? Well, some slaves sort of mentioned it. Some slaves, for example, were considered to be expert at reading passages from the Bible, so they had to be literate to do that. Now, some of these slaves were saying, well, look, while I'm employed as a blacksmith on the plantation, I've got, I handle all the blacksmithing for the whole plantation, all the horses, the oxen, the mules, the donkeys, the fences, the ironwork, the iron gates for the front of the, I do all that work, and I've got a captive, sort of, I'm kept busy, and I get all that work to do. I've got apprentices, sort of, that I'm teaching, and I'm a privileged person. I have a high status job within the. So the idea that this was a slave that was being whipped and beaten by evil fascist Nazis, if not Hitler personally, that's absolute bullshit. The guy was he was a high state. The black blacksmith was a high status person within the thing, someone who was respected and treated with respect, not only by the white people, but by the by the other slaves. He was a state. One of the slaves had a problem with the white masters or overseers. He could go to the high status black blacksmith and say, look, could you intercede on my behalf? Very high status role. The same as, say, there could be a black woman head housekeeper, and she'd be treated with respect by the family, relied upon and depended on, and so there was high status slaves. But let's suppose that the black blacksmith goes, well, hey, I'm a skilled trade. I'm gonna buy my freedom, and I'm gonna open up a blacksmithing place down the road or wherever. Now, at that point, the blacksmith, these guys are smart enough to know, well, that's a whole different ball game. Now I don't have a captive market. I'm not a high status person within a community anymore. I'm just some guy out there, trying to set up a business. I've got to buy all the bellows and buy the facility or rent it or lease it or something. I've got to get the raw materials I need, the tools, all this sort of stuff. That's quite expensive. I've got to go into debt to do that. Then I've got the uncertainty of attracting customers and negotiating pricing. Why would I go into such a world of uncertainty, having to compete out there in the open marketplace of other blacksmiths who are out there? Why would I do that? That's a high risk gig. Whereas in the in the plantation here, I'm a respected, high status, skilled person. They don't treat me like a slave or anything like that. If I wanted to buy my freedom, I could, but why would I? Now, so we've got this interesting conundrum here that high skills, and thus high status slaves, that the white owners are saying this guy is highly skilled, he is superior at this job, and so on and so forth. That means the person's dependable, reliable. They've got the job, they've got the skills, they've got the knowledge. They're a desirable, and you bear in mind it's a labour that they want. This is a desirable employee. So, all their needs are taken care of. They've got a place to live in. The clothes are provided. The food's provided. They've got a decent garden lot behind the house that they have, where they can grow their own vegetables. They can have a few chickens for it, and all that sort of stuff. So they're well taken care of, and they've got a high status role, and they don't have to want for anything. He doesn't get a wage necessarily, but everything is provided. If he wants to take a day off and go into town, that fine. He wants to use the plantation owner's horse and cart. Go ahead. He's got a great relationship, and he's a valued skill on that plantation. So the skilled slaves, why would they want freedom? What would be the purpose of that? There wouldn't be. The unskilled slave, what's he going to do? Just sell his day labor around the place? That's no good, and nor is he in a position necessarily to buy unless someone pays for him, nor is he in a position to buy his freedom. So, for him, the lot isn't that good, but that's the same as any low skilled, low IQ laborer today. They're not going to do well. They've got nothing to sell in terms of skills or capabilities. And if they're lazy and difficult to get on with as well, then they've got almost no value. So this was the interesting thing, and I hadn't realised that. But certainly of the auction lists that I saw, and I haven't looked at every one of them, around 20% of the people were deemed as high skilled. This is in technical skills like blacksmithing or carpentry, stonemasonry, that sort of stuff. And then there were people who had there was probably about an equal amount that had same also high skills, such as a cook or a musician, and so on, that were there as well. So where did all these skilled people go? If you look at the amount of skilled people in the United States today in terms of blacks, so how many skilled blacks sort of are there? Assuming that back in the days of slavery, 40% of them. Now they were forced, if you want to use the term, forced to learn a skill. Some of the plantation owners complained that whereas a white person could pick it up in 5 years, it would take a black person 10 years. But let's put that aside for a moment and say that these people were acquiring skill and were deemed at the end of it, at the end of their education, their apprenticeship, they were deemed as highly skilled. Not just skilled, or he knows a bit about blacksmithing. Highly skilled. He is superior at this job. Now that's a ringing endorsement. Whether regardless whether you're black or white, having that on your CV. I mean, wow. So these people clearly had mastered the technical arts and were delivering quality, reliable, dependable work. Where is that today? Does it even exist today? I would argue not, or certainly not to that extent. So what was different then? Why is it? Like if 20% were highly skilled back in the days of slavery, those evil white people, surely there'd be 80% would be skilled today. So what has changed? And you can see why the slaves weren't those skilled workers weren't interested in buying their slavery, because it wouldn't improve their circumstances. In fact, their circumstances would become much less. They would cease to be a respected member of the community, and they would have to take on all sorts of risk and uncertainty. Why would you do that? So they were more than happy to stay as slaves. You've been with Tacitus today. Your pushback, John. Thank you for listening.